Okay, so real quickly, there will be full game spoilers for Age of Calamity in this video, but I have a feeling that most people who care about those have already played the game by this point, so I'm not really worried about it. Anyways, Age of Calamity was released about 5 months ago, and while it certainly was a great game in its own right, it also disappointed many hardcore fans, myself included, since it wasn't quite the prequel to Breath of the Wild that we had anticipated. The storyline was changed, they introduced time travel, and made it so the outcome was incredibly different. I, for one, was excited that we were finally getting a game where the good guys didn't win, and where the final battle ended in grim defeat, but we ended up just getting a completely different game where the good guys win yet again. Now, one thing I hear get talked about quite frequently is whether or not the game is canon. There are some good points for both sides, and I honestly can't decide which I think it is. However, I have a different question to answer today, that being whether or not it matters if it's canon. So without further ado, let's get into the video. In order to figure out whether or not Age of Calamity matters in the Zelda timeline, let's first consider the story. The game starts out during the final memory of Breath of the Wild, with Zelda just having activated her sealing power for the first time. This power awakens Tarako, who breaks free from his box and goes back in time in order to prevent the calamity from occurring. The events begin occurring how they would in Breath of the Wild, up until the point where they meet Tarako, at which point things begin to change. First off, all of the Sheikah Towers raise, which is something that definitely doesn't happen until Link beats the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild. Also, he does something to the Sheikah Slate so everyone is able to use the runes, which is also something that we don't ever see used in Breath of the Wild. In fact, we never even see the runes other than the camera used in the memories, so we really have no idea if they were even on the Sheikah Slate at that point. Finally, he warps all of the second generation heroes into the Divine Beast to help the previous set of champions defeat their respective blights. All of this goes to show that the game is certainly different from the original, but none of it shows whether or not it is canon. On the one hand, the fact that Tarako went back in time creating a different timeline that didn't actually interfere with the first timeline means that it could certainly still be canon, but on the other hand, since all of the new champions had memories of going back and fighting alongside their other champions, then that would mean in Breath of the Wild's sequel, they would almost certainly make mention of it, which doesn't seem very likely to happen. In this scenario, it doesn't matter whether the game is canon or not, since it all occurs within a different timeline, and so it shouldn't affect the timeline of Breath of the Wild. We could just count it as a one-off and ignore it when referring to the Zelda timeline, since there will almost certainly not be any other games connected to it. However, if the champions that Tarako pulled from another timeline were the same as the ones from the original timeline, then that would certainly affect Breath of the Wild too. Wow, I sure just said timeline a lot. Anyhow, whether or not the game actually matters really depends on whether the champions that Tarako brought to the world of Age of Calamity are really from the same timeline as Breath of the Wild. And given that there's no reason that a third timeline should exist, I think it is safe to assume that they really are the same as from Breath of the Wild. That means that it comes down to Breath of the Wild's sequel for whether or not the game counts as canon or not. If the champions mention their cross-dimensional travel to save Hyrule from Calamity Ganon in the game, then I think it would be safe to assume that the game is canon. However, if they don't, then we can just assume that the game is one large fanfiction by Koei Tecmo in which the champions don't die. Okay, so before I make my final conclusion, let's summarize what we just covered in this video. So, Tarako left Breath of the Wild and came to Age of Calamity, where he changed a whole bunch of stuff, including bringing over the champions from Breath of the Wild, in order to alter the outcome of the Great Calamity. In doing so, he put Nintendo in the peculiar position of having to make a statement of whether or not the game is canon, which is something they have avoided doing thus far, for some reason. If Nintendo decides to put a mention of Age of Calamity in the game, then we can assume that it is in fact canon. However, if they ignore it, then we can just assume that it isn't. Given all of that information, I think it does matter whether or not it's canon. It was very close to being an isolated timeline, but when Tarako brought in the new champions, that tied it into the original timeline. That is really the only reason why the game would matter as canon, since that decision would directly impact something in Breath of the Wild sequel. There is a case to be made, albeit a very tiny one, that Tarako could have drawn the champions from yet another timeline, in which case it wouldn't matter whether or not it was canon, as it would no longer have any impact on the main story of Breath of the Wild. Unless, plot twist, Age of Calamity is canon and Breath of the Wild sequel isn't. I'm just joking, of course. Or am I? Thank you so much for watching the whole video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then be sure to drop a like down below. Subscribe to the channel for more Zelda content that I'm sure you'll enjoy, and follow my Twitter and Instagram accounts, which will both be linked below. I'm glad I got to make this video. It's something that I've been thinking about since the game first released, and I'm glad I finally got to get my thoughts out about it to all of you. My guess for Age of Calamity is that it will end up not being canon, as I can't see Nintendo referencing a crazy time travel adventure completely unrelated to the real events of the game. It is weird that Nintendo has held out for so long in saying whether the game is canon or not. Perhaps they've been trying to get people to think it's canon so they could sell more copies, even though they know it really isn't. That would be awfully shady though, so I really hope that's not the case. Anyways, that's all I have for you guys today, so until next time, I'm TruthForce, and I'm out.